Oh, the plane's up there now.
Yeah.
Good day again from Auckland, New Zealand. There was a rainbow outside just a few minutes ago, and before I could find a good place to set up where the wind noise wasn't too great, the rainbow had gone. So I've just settled for an inside view here again. I want to think with you again this week a little bit more based on last week, and if you didn't listen to last week's, you might want to go back and do that. That's the one dated January the 8th. I still haven't left for my cruise yet, but by the time you actually watch this, we'll have toured all the way around the islands of New Zealand and headed our way toward Australia for the second part of our cruise trip. But I want to think with you today not about cruising on the sea, but about cruising on the sea of being a church. The church is sometimes symbolized by a ship, and the world we live in is like the storms, and we have a place that helps us to navigate our way through the changes of life, and the ship becomes the church out on the sea of life. And many of you have experienced that, so you know about that firsthand. We've been thinking about the difference between our life together in rows, where we sit in rows and spectate at something, and then our life together in circles, where, as the old song from Cheers said, everybody knows your name, and if you invite somebody in, they quickly get assimilated into life within the group. A healthy church usually has a combination of the row experience and the circle experience. And I thought about a church that I moved to in the year 1986. I had been an associate pastor and then had the opportunity to go to an inner city church that had once been a pretty large church and had a large building facility. And let me describe to you what an average Sunday looked like by the late 1980s, by the time I had arrived as pastor. So on an average Sunday morning when the church was at its heyday, they had, like a 8:30 church service and then an 11 o'clock church service in order to fit an average of about 300 people in on a Sunday morning. And then they had a big facility, including a 2-story classroom. And so if they had 300 on Sunday, they might have about 250 that gathered in between the two worship services. And there were all these rooms and places where people could grow. From the smallest of children to the oldest adult, they all had their circles. So Sunday morning was an experience of circles and rows. Circles where you gathered in the various places within the building, and then rows where people gathered for their worship time together. By the time I had arrived, actually they still had circles and rows. On Sunday morning we had one worship service, 10:30 a.m., just like the one we have at South Roanoke, and would have about 90 people on a good Sunday. But then about 70, if I remember correctly, would gather at 9:15 for 5 different groups that had an opportunity to circle up together. There were 4 adult classes. I call it the retired people that could still move around, retired people that couldn't move around quite so much, a small adult class of people of mixed age, and then a class mostly of ladies of well up in years. And then there was one class for anybody under age 65, and that was really a volunteer from the church, my son, and usually 1 or 2 other kids. So that was the extent of people who gathered other than those 4 adult classes. But they still had their circles, they still had their connections, and those classes did other things occasionally during the year, like having social events and parties together. And so they had the opportunity to keep the strength of that church going. In some ways, the old Sunday school and worship service system was pretty simple, because Sunday morning was dedicated to your circles and your rows, And a newcomer would quickly, they might show up at the worship service, but they would get invited to a circle. Sometimes people would come to the circle first and then go to the experience of Rose. Now, another issue with that, it's pretty facility intensive when you think about it. Imagine all of those rooms that we built, which at our best were used 1 hour a week. I don't know why we thought that was sort of a good idea. In the old days, back before churches had these big buildings, classes would meet in the corner of the sanctuary and have time together in prayer, and then they would move some partitions and gather for the worship service. But by the time that I was starting my ministry, this particular church had completed its facilities in 1959. You just built a room for everything, even if it was only used 1 hour a week. Kind of interesting. Walk through our upstairs at South Roanoke sometime and realize it's a much busier place in 2024 than probably it was in the 1950s when it opened. But it's not as busy on Sunday. Does anything happen upstairs on Sunday morning? One day we did, not too long ago, because the older children had moved to a room upstairs. But by and large, it's a through the week ministry now for our preschool. Our facilities and their functions have changed so much. But at its best, I wonder, back in the 1950s when it was brand new, I expect there were kids in all of those adult upstairs classrooms. But during the week, you tell me what went on during those gatherings there. Now, we can play Ain't It Awful, and things have changed for a long, long time, but the truth is there are still a lot of churches that reach a lot of kids on Sunday, but things have changed completely. In last week's Boost, I talked about that church in Atlanta there, and so in that church, while mom and dad are in the worship gathering, there's a place for their age group together, and it all happens at the same time. And then the teens have their own experience whenever. There's a benefit and a cost to the changes that have happened in our life together. In some ways, I'm pretty creative, but in some ways, I'm kind of old-fashioned, and I kind of saw some value to the old days where kids were actually with their parents in the time of worshiping together. So you had your circle groups by age, and then you had your row groups where everybody's together. The churches that are reaching a lot of young families today kind of don't have that. The adults are in one room, kids are off doing their thing, and then they all leave together. Another thing that has changed in these days is that many churches are realizing the benefits of off-site groups. You don't have to build a huge building to accommodate everyone there. When you think about facilities and safety and scheduling, some churches went through a time when they would have church night, so childcare would be offered and there would be something for all ages, like say on Wednesday night. But people's schedules are so crazy these days. You might have a men's prayer group that has about 8 or 10 men that meet at a coffee shop at 6:15 in the morning, because that works for those 8 or 10. Wouldn't work for everybody. Works for them. You don't have to build a building for somebody to get together for 1 hour. With people's schedules and with our different needs, it's important to be as creative as possible to find a way for people to circle up. But it doesn't all have to happen all at the same time in a huge building on Sunday morning. The most important thing is not when or where, it is the leader. What about the size? Somebody once said the best size for a circle group is 3 to 15. That's right. It could be as few as three. And Jesus himself said, where two or three together are there in my name, I am there as well. So if you have three, you also have Jesus, and that makes four. Three is a little bit tough, but it can be done. 15 actually is even tougher because there's kind of a geometric effect of the number of relationships that people have. And so if you have 15 people in a circle, that's actually so big that people start to get disconnected. You know what used to happen in the old Sunday school system? So Sunday school classes would get very successful, and they'd have 20 or 25 in their class. I'm thinking of adult classes mainly at this point. And you know what would happen? Instead of circles, they'd have rows. So you'd have rows at 9:15, and you'd have rows at 10:30 because that was too many people to sit in a circle. If you're going to deliver a lecture to a group and call it Sunday school, it really doesn't matter whether there's 10, 20, 40, or 100. Just line them up and talk. What we're talking about here is a little bit something different, where people begin to interact, to learn to lean on each other, trust in each other, and you begin to see why 15 becomes sort of like the upper limit for that to happen. What about how often? You know, a lot of things in the church happen maybe on a monthly basis, but for real strong life change, let me tell you, once a month is really tough. Now, why would that be? That's because these groups are not just adding some interesting contact, they are the church watching over each other in love. And if you're part of a group of, say, 10 people who meets once a month, and you're out of town 1 month, and then you have a sick child the next month, that means if you happen to miss 2 in a row, it's 3 months before you have gathered back with that group. If you're just presenting content that's kind of interesting, really doesn't matter, whatever, you can do that. But if you're growing together as a small church family, a church group becomes like a family, that regular interaction is necessary. Probably best of all would be once a week, but a good practical compromise is to make sure a group at least gathers a couple times a month. I heard one model where a group would gather on, say, like the first and third Thursday evening, and then once a month they would also they would do that, so that would be twice a month. And then once a month they'd try to do something kind of fun, like go to the bowling alley together, have a picnic together where the kids are invited. So that provides a good way to do a lot of face-to-face time together so that we really have the interaction together to help each other over the humps. If you're trying to maintain thin ties, occasional meetings are fine, But if you're trying to build strong ties, you really need to invest that time together. What about Zoom gatherings? Actually, we learned a lot during COVID, and some of those things can work there. It can be even tougher there. But sometimes people are able, if they do have those at least occasional opportunities to meet face-to-face together, they're sometimes able to get that regularity by having an online gathering together and able to pull that off. So never say never, but let me tell you, we are in a world where we need that face-to-face contact. So a group of 4 or 5 that can sit down over coffee together, that's better than 20 that sit together in a Zoom room, actually. There's room for that. I will say my particular bias at South Roanoke United Methodist is don't ask me to be in charge of Zoom arrangements. If you feel called to put together a Zoom group and you need me to be a part of it, let me know. I want to spend the time before a gathering thinking about the content of what we're doing, not trying to arrange and make sure everyone's there. When somebody else can be doing the technical parts of it, it frees me up in my pastor role to be able to jump in and do that. So there's just some things for you to think about in terms of the practicalities. My guess is that the old Sunday school system is not going to reemerge for most of us. There are some very independent fundamentalist churches where whatever the pastor says, go. And they say, if you're going to be a leader, you need to be in Sunday school and church. So there are a few churches that still make that work. But most thriving churches have found new creative ways to help connect people in circles, as well as still having the joy of gathering together in the big rows. But pray about it. Nothing's off the table, and then even if you don't have the 20 rooms full on Sunday morning at a specified hour, it's still possible that before or after worship can be a good time for a group, because if you've made the effort to come to the worship service, if you can extend that a little on the front end or on the back end, nothing wrong with that. And sometimes that's easier than finding the time to get back together during the week. Well, I've given you a lot to think about. I hope you'll keep praying about that. And I look forward on the next video, which should be available around January 22nd, to talking about the importance of leadership. Having a good leader is really the much more important thing than where or when or how often or how many people or what the topic is of a particular group. So I really look forward to the opportunity to share with you about that, the importance of leadership. Have a great day.